Hey, thanks for coming back to the show. On the screen with me, you can see him there, is Dr. Pierre Kory. He is an intensive care specialist. He has board certifications all over the place. I'm not going to go down the long list of this gentleman. You can find him online. He actually, let me just point out something. This gentleman in May, early May, testified in front of the Senate regarding the Math Plus protocol. We're going to talk about that today. You'll see it on the screen here. Math Plus protocol is a specific protocol that is used once you're in the hospital and used when the doctor feels it's appropriate, the oxygen levels are dropping. There are two shows that I've done, one with Dr. Verone and one with Dr. Merrick. You can go to seanburke.net and find it. You can also find it on YouTube. They go over, those two doctors just tell you everything you want to know about Math Plus and how it's working, and it's working incredibly well. The success rates in both of those hospitals in Norfolk, Virginia, and in Houston are incredible, about 5% mortality between the two of them. And it's really showing to be very efficacious. Now, we're not going to go through that with Dr. Kory. Dr. Kory is part of the loose group of doctors that is using Math Plus, and you can find more about Math Plus at covid19criticalcare.com, as you can see on the screen. Welcome, Dr. Kory.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You're on the hot seat. You know, you just had an article. First of all, let me just point out, I listened to your testimony in front of Congress. It was very impressive. In that testimony, you very strongly pushed using steroids. At the time, the WHO and the CDC were saying not to use steroids with COVID. You were adamant, and your group, Dr. Merrick and others, were adamant that this was a mistake. And, came out with the study, I think it was called the recovery study, I believe that's what it's called, that showed that using steroids actually reduced death by about a third, I believe. Again, I'm not a doctor. And I just want to point out, anyone listening, anything we talk about as far as medicine is not medical advice. So let's just take that away from the show. And also, there's no money being exchanged between either of us. I am very interested in this protocol, and I think it's important for our country. So anyway, you were first throwing it down. We got to use steroids. It came out and you were proven correct.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Nice job.
Thank you. So, and I'm going to bring it up, Sean, but you talked also, I was featured, or I was mentioned in this New York Times Magazine article that came out online yesterday. And, the editor of New England Journal of Medicine called me lucky for predicting that, as if I didn't know that they were going to work. And I find that a bit shocking. So a couple of things about the recovery trial. You just mentioned that we knew and we believed that the data from the prior pandemics showed that steroids were life-saving. What's fascinating about that, Sean, is the studies that we used to sort of prove that, or to support our assertions, showed the exact same magnitude of benefit that the recovery trial did. So another sort of pet peeve of mine is, they did do a randomized control trial, which is a really big one, but you have to keep in mind that was a placebo-controlled trial. So 4,000 patients in that trial got placebo. And studying a medication that we believed was life-saving. And so we would have never done that trial because we couldn't have. You can't take a patient and give them placebo if you believe that the medicine actually is going to work. I'm not faulting the investigators of that trial. But anyway, what they showed, the same magnitude of benefit that they showed, we had data to show that happened in H1N1 and SARS epidemics as well. And so it really replicated what we already knew.
So, you were ahead of the pack. It was proven. It's got to be nice to have that, to say, hey, we have validated evidence, though you already saw the validated evidence prior. It's not like you were going out on a limb. It was already sitting there.
Right.
So now,
can I mention one more thing, that how we use steroids work? Because that also came in the testimony. I want to say it again, is that when COVID hit, Sean, so I'm from New York, right? So I was at the University of Wisconsin. I've since resigned. Part of the troubles at the University of Wisconsin began with that Senate testimony. They did not like my opinions. They wanted to separate from the university. And I told them, I don't remember when I said it was the university's opinion, but anyway, long story short, the other reason why we knew steroids worked is I have colleagues who work in ICUs all over New York City. And when New York City got inundated and the ICUs were filling and they were running out of ventilators, they were doing expert supportive care, which was what was recommended, and they were running out of beds and ventilators. The patients were not responding. They were dying at really, really high rates. And a lot of my colleagues, they knew they had to change course. They started steroids, and guess what happened? They started to see that the patients were actually responding to steroids. So we already knew on the ground that steroids worked, and we also knew from our reading of the evidence that steroids worked in the past.
So what is supportive care? I don't think people really know. What was being done?
So supportive care is you basically treat symptoms, right? So if you can't breathe, if your oxygen levels are low, we give you oxygen, right? If you really can't breathe, you need some more support, we'll give you a ventilator, right? Ventilators really aren't treatments. They just support the organs that are failing, right? So a treatment is something that's going to reverse the actual process in your body. And for viral syndromes, we don't really have any established antivirals, especially for coronavirus we didn't. So there was no specific therapies that were recommended. It's just, nutrition, fluids. If you're too sick to drink or keep up with your fluid intake, we give you fluids, we give you nutrition, we give you oxygen, a ventilator. If you have a fever, we give you a Tylenol, and that's what supportive care is. And you hope that the body does the work to fight off the virus.
Right. So we had that in the initial stages. I think we saw it magnified because New York got hit so bloody hard, and all these patients went in. We have supportive care happening. And there's this, it's pretty well known that if you went on a ventilator at that time in New York, 80, 70 to 100% died. I've heard, very, very high death rate. So,
extremely high.
So were you there? I know you've been, and tell us your COVID experience.
I've lost all sense of time. In fact, I use terms like early COVID, mid COVID, late COVID, and I don't even know what they mean. But, I think if we're talking about like March, early April, I was not in New York. So I was the chief of the critical care service and medical director of the main ICU at University of Wisconsin. And we were preparing like crazy for it to hit Wisconsin. Remember, there was a huge delay before you started seeing it. So I was really busy at work, helping teams prepare. We were almost reinventing the hospital and workflows and processes. But so when New York got really hit really hard, I was in Wisconsin. But once it seemed that the curve flattened in Wisconsin, I asked for a humanitarian leave, and the university let me go. And I went to New York, and I actually ran my old ICU for 5 weeks. So end of April to end of May is when I was there. But that was after the surge.
It was after the peak. So were you?
But I saw a lot of patients there. Yeah.
Were you using Math Plus there?
I was using some forms of it. I was getting pushback on some of the vitamin D, just little ticky stacks of it. Mostly I was using pretty aggressive anticoagulation and methylprednisolone, as well as ascorbic acid. So I was using Math, the Plus a little bit less so, but certainly Math was standard for me.
And the results that you were seeing?
Well, not the same as my colleagues, and there's some really important reason for that. And you even mentioned it in your introduction, is that, especially in critical illness, we talk about this concept of the golden hour or golden hours, which is when you intervene before someone goes into multi-organ failure or severe organ failure, you got to get to them early. The medicines have to be delivered early. And when I got to the ICU on April 27th, many of the patients that I took over had been on ventilators for 1 to 2 weeks. Some of them have gotten a little bit of steroids, not. So I'm going to tell you, if you ask me about my results, not very good. But that's not to say that the medicine doesn't work. It was too late. These patients were really, really sick, and
it seems like timing is crucial with this. Crucial.
It's so important to critical illness. We talk about the resuscitation phase where you got to get there, you got to intervene early. And so many medicines we know work really well when you get to them early. And that's one of the challenges with evidence-based medicine in critical care is, for instance, I'm going to refer again to this article, the journalist wrote about some of the therapies in math that they are controversial. So anytime I hear one of the medicines that I know works being dismissed or described as controversial, I get triggered, and I'll tell you why. Is because, we have tons of studies studying medicines, but not every study is the same. For medicine to work, it has to be the right dose, the right duration, it has to be initiated at the right time and in the right patient. And when you have all these studies, which sometimes shows it really works well, and other times it seems like it doesn't work, the naysayers say, see, this trial said it didn't work. The yay-sayers say this trial worked. And so anybody can argue anything. And you have to be very critical and look at the studies. And so I just want to mention that as that initiation phase is so important. And I got to tell you, it's very elusive to randomized controlled trials, because if you try to do a randomized controlled trial in a critical illness, very often, by the time you've identified the patient, they meet criteria, you get consent, you get the medication, many hours have passed. And so we have a whole litany of what are called negative trials in critical care, meaning they don't show any difference. And that's because you're not getting to them early.
So an hour can make a difference?
Oh, absolutely. An hour can make a difference. Oh, yeah. That's been shown most eloquently with antibiotics. In fact, they've shown that mortality increases by 7% for every hour delay of antibiotics in septic shock.
Wow.
And I have data. I did probably my one contribution in medicine in my career. Hopefully, maybe I'll have more, but is I have data showing the same thing with intravenous ascorbic acid. That intravenous ascorbic acid in septic shock, after about 8 to 12 hours, has no benefit. But if you give it early, like in the first 6 hours of illness, it's incredibly profound how well those patients do. And so, yeah, the question about hours, absolutely do they make a difference?
Yeah, I have an experience with my friend in Ireland. For those who've been listening to me know about this, she went into septic shock. And when she was in the waiting room, the doctor peeked out and saw that her lips were turning blue, ran out, grabbed her in the wheelchair, and they put in this sepsis protocol that is similar, a bit similar to the math protocol, using ascorbic acid, vitamin C. Right away, immediately. It was one of the first things they did, and I attribute it to saving her life because it was a quick intervention. But it seems like people, especially in New York, I can understand hearing about, hey, if you go in the hospital and you get on a ventilator, you're going to die, wouldn't want to walk in the door. And I think that people are afraid all over the country that there isn't the success rate that they had hoped to see. They're afraid to go into these hospitals, and it's becoming too late. Is that right?
That you're hitting that right on the head. And so it's funny when you asked me, did you use math in New York when you were there, and what were your results? So my first reason why I didn't see great results is so many of the patients were late. In fact, I was telling my team, I want to see a patient who first presents to the hospital. And guess what happened? They gave me those patients. And you know what those patients were? They were very late, yet they were coming from home. And it's for the reason that you just said, is everybody was scared of the hospital, the stories they were hearing during the surge, and they just didn't want to go. And so we had patients showing up very advanced in COVID inflammation in the lungs. The lungs were really working very, very poorly at that time. So even then I was missing what we call windows of intervention. And so, yes, I want to say, you have people listening here, Sean, I would tell them, at the first symptom of onset of shortness of breath, go. You need to be evaluated. You want to get there early.
Dr. Merrick, on our show, we talked about those little oximeters for people at home can just take it. And when you get down below 90 or so, I don't remember what the number was, but is that valid? Is that a smart way for someone to approach it? Because a lot of times you don't even know if you're losing your oxygen.
Right. That's the thing in this disease, the way it presents, because it has a little bit different of an inflammatory pattern. But yes, patients can have low oxygen without feeling terribly short of breath. So a pulse oximeter is a good one. A couple of caveats to that. So my wife is a lung specialist, and she actually takes care of, so I'm more of an expert of acute lung injury, acute respiratory failure. My wife is an expert at these chronic lung diseases. And so she has these patients with these very severe chronic lung diseases, and all of her patients have pulse oxes. And she says in her experience that generally a pharmacy purchased pulse oximeter is somewhere between 3 and 5 points below what a hospital oximeter will read. And the reason why I mention that is I had some experiences with a patient and with a friend where I made them go to the hospital and their oxygen level actually wasn't that low. So, small caveat, but it's still better than nothing, and I would use it.
If you're dropping down to 80, you better run into the hospital.
Yeah, and anything below 90 on those, I would definitely go get evaluated.
Get in there, yeah. Yeah, that's what I've heard that is. Okay, so we have Math Plus. We have push, but we're not having when I see the results you guys get, I don't understand why more hospitals aren't using it. And in fact, in the last show with Dr. Barone, we talked about it'd be nice to have a list of what hospitals are using it. I've had listeners email me and go, is there a list? Where do I go to actually get Math Plus? So why is there so much? Why, first of all, it's showing it's working. It looks efficacious. It looks safe. It's plentiful. It's not new drugs. Why isn't this used more?
I think you're making too much sense, Sean. So this is what I think you're overlooking. is that your statement that says we're showing it's working, I think that is true to a layperson, to someone who simply looks at the data and sees the outcomes that are coming out of our hospitals and feels that it's associated and likely the cause of math plus protocol being used. Physicians do not think that way. Immediately, a physician will think the following. If they hear of these incredible results coming out of one hospital, they immediately dismiss that as single-centered data. It's almost like a four-letter word. So to a physician, when they hear of one center claiming that they have really good results, they think it's biased data. They will not believe it. You need to present it in a prospective, randomized, controlled fashion before they will actually think that data is valid. So they're going to have very, very high thresholds before they will believe anything, even in a pandemic and even in a deadly disease. Okay. And even when you have someone like Dr. Marek, he's the second most published doctor in our specialty. He's been a leader for decades. Everybody knows his name. He has incredibly high scientific credibility, and yet people don't want to believe. I mean, physicians won't believe it. They're very, very skeptical of anything, and they refuse to make a mistake getting behind a therapy that might later be shown to not work as well as they think it did.
Okay, so the pushback, there's no double-blind study. So what's the problem with doing a double-blind study?
Well, interesting. So in that New York Times Magazine article, they talked about that challenge, which is when COVID hit, doctors broke into two groups right there. And I call them sort of the frontline doctors. Most of guys like me and gals like me, or my colleagues, we work in ICUs. We're on the front lines taking care of these patients. And when we started to do that, and we started to think about some protocols of stuff that might work, we were very quickly judged by those above us and behind us, like some of the other specialists, infectious disease and whatnot. They questioned what we were doing, and they told us that we shouldn't do anything outside of a randomized controlled trial. And so what's the problem with that? So I don't want to say I'm against trials. I do think it's really important we decide or find out if something works. But the manner in which you do it, you have to be very, very careful. So what I try to cite, because in this article, this New York Times Magazine article, Sean, nowhere was it mentioned the Helsinki Declaration of Principles of Medical Ethics and Medical Research from 1963, when the world of medical came together and they formulated guiding principles on how to do research. And no one, in no article I've read about during COVID, I have ever heard Helsinki document mentioned. And I find it really odd and egregious, because if you go to that document, the one overriding principle, which kind of infuses all of the others, is that the patient before you, their welfare is of paramount importance. It's not the trial that should be your motivating factor. It's, yes, we all want to know if something works. We all do think it's important, but you shouldn't be worrying about the future patient. It's not like, everyone's like saying, if we don't figure out if it works now, how are we going to treat the ones in the future? Well, the ones in the future is not your patient now, right? You have to keep this paramount focus on the patient before you. So that's one problem, is that it may not be appropriate to do a randomized controlled trial. The second thing is, if you look at that document, there's a section about the use of placebo. And it's a very interesting section, but they really limit the cases in which you should use a placebo. And they even say at the end of that section, extreme caution must be used around the use of placebo. So to just, enter someone willy-nilly into a placebo-controlled trial is not a decision that should be taken lightly. But yet, here you are with doctors who won't believe anything that's not a placebo-controlled trial. So it's really difficult. And the last thing I'm going to say in that is there are other ways of getting data and of learning things. At least for me, I don't have such a ridiculously conservative, strict threshold to understand whether something works. I look at the biologic plausibility. I look at the summation of the observational data. I will look at trends. You can look at databases. You can look at registries, and you can get a sense whether something works. You won't have the certainty of a placebo-controlled trial, but sometimes you'll get good enough direction in how to treat a patient. So that's one of the problems with the randomized controlled trial. And the other thing is, what the article also mentions, not everybody wants to be in a placebo-controlled trial. Sometimes recruitment is difficult. right? I particularly for this disease would not want to sign up for a placebo. And I understand why some patients don't want that. You know, they want the doctor to try
the good stuff.
Yeah.
They want the stuff that works. Now, you as a doctor, though, ethics, I mean, where do we go with the ethics of here's the question I have. Can you tell if something works? I mean, we're talking, does it have to be a double blind, or can you apply something to a patient enough times that you go, you know what, this actually does work? And then now you're stuck, because if you're supposed to do a double blind with that, you know it works. So now what are you going to do? Not give it to those patients? But I'm curious, can you tell yourself using it enough?
So absolutely. But the real answer is it depends on the therapy. So it depends how potent the therapy is. So in medicine, we have this term called number needed to treat. And the number needed to treat is this number that's derived from let's say you're looking at an outcome of death, right? So if you can get a death rate from 50% down to 40%, that's a reduction of 10%, absolute risk reduction of 10%. That means the number needed to treat for that therapy to save a life is 10, right? So you know that if every 10 patients you treat, you'll save one life. That's a pretty potent therapy.
That's pretty good.
And we don't have a lot. So the most potent therapies that we know of in the world, right? So antibiotics, we guess it is because we've never done a randomized controlled trial on antibiotics because it's obvious that it works. You don't need, it would be unethical. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah. Defibrillating a patient who's in ventricular tachycardia, that's considered to have a number needed to treat of 2. You defibrillate, for every 2 patients you defibrillate, you're going to save one life. So my answer to your question is, if the therapy is really potent, it can be detected by an astute clinician at the bedside. Many interventions, for instance, like statin for heart attack or stroke or aspirin for a heart attack, those have number needed to treat of 50, 70, 80. You probably will never be able to get the difference. You understand what I'm saying? So there's a ton of medicines that we use that we know are helpful, but the impacts are relatively small and undetectable at the bedside. So, however, let me pull out a couple that I think are detectable at the bedside. So number one is steroids in something like ARDS, which is what COVID causes. It's called acute respiratory distress syndrome. It's when the lungs fail from being hyperinflamed. You can see patients improve temporally associated with the steroids. So a good astute clinician who's watching hour by hour, really taking care of their patients, starts drug A, and in the next 6 hours, they start to see a softening and even a solidifying and an improvement, a little change in trajectory of the physiologic signs. If you see that pattern over and over again, you get the sense it's that drug, okay? But not a lot of drugs will give you that amount of sort of feedback at the bedside where it's detectable by a clinician. Is that a fair answer? So it's only some medicines, they have to be powerful. The steroids is one, ascorbic acid is another. That to me was the most impressive I've seen, is when I deliver high doses of IV ascorbic acid, I would say within 2 to 3 hours, you see these profound physiologic changes.
And have you seen that with Math Plus, with COVID? Have you experienced it? I know you've been in a different situation than Dr. Verone and Dr.
So I'm going to say no, because when I was in New York, I saw nothing but what I would say are patients chronically ill with COVID. I didn't see acutes. And by the time I left New York, we had no new cases. So this is end of May. There was just no new COVIDs that I saw. And since then, I've been doing sort of research and writing and doing other stuff. But like I told you on Monday, I'm taking over an ICU in a hotspot down in South Carolina. And so I'm going to be immersed and I'm going to be using this to treat patients.
It's going to be interesting to see how that goes. I'm curious. It seems like there's a war going on between the doctors on the ground and the researchers, or I call them medical experts. You see them on TV. They're not really on in the room within the ICU. Right. And it's pretty easy from the ivory tower to look down and go, all right, well, this is the plan we're going to do. Where you guys, from what I've researched, in ICU especially, have to treat what's in front of you. And you have to jump on what you see. So it seems like there's a bit of a war going on within the medical community between these two sides. Am I right?
I totally agree. And I think the more removed you are from it, the more dispassionate you can become, right?
Sure.
Where we become accused of maybe being too emotional or, too swayed or influenced by, what we're seeing. And so there is a little bit of a difference in perspective. The other difference is, like I said, is I don't think everything has to be randomized controlled trial. I talked about the Helsinki principles. This discord also, which the article talked about. This article, when they talked about all the fights that broke out in all these hospitals between these kind of two intellectual or philosophical camps, right? Those who felt that we absolutely had to do randomized controlled trials, and those who said, let me figure, we could see what was wrong with these patients. Like as an intensivist, I saw that they were clotting at rates far higher than I'd ever seen in any other disease. And there was very quickly data coming out of China and Italy and the US showing that. So to tell me that I need a randomized controlled trial to put someone on a blood thinner, to me is insane. Just let me doctor. I can see that they're clotting like crazy. Patients on like these dialysis circuits, they were clotting the tubing. You could see it with your eyes. So the idea that people were attacking me for being aggressive with a blood thinner, I just couldn't listen to it. I was just, leave me alone. Let me doctor. I'm going to take care of this patient the best way I can. So that was one thing. Is some things you didn't need trials for. The other thing was, in this article, Sean, the writer of the article, I thought, left the reader with the idea that the clinicians got a lot of things wrong. And the reason why is, as she retells the history, it went very short history, right? This is, we're talking about March until now, the last 4-month history of what it was like on the front lines and what these discussions and fights were like. You're left with the idea that everything that the clinicians were using turned out to be proven wrong. And I think that's an incorrect impression. And I'll tell you why. I differentiate some of the medicines that were being used in terms of the category of unproven experimental. For instance, for me, remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, tocilizumab, those to me are all experimental and unproven. You know why? There's no evidence base for them being used in patients in this disease. I've never given those drugs in an ICU. In fact, I've given tocilizumab maybe once in my life. I've given hydroxychloroquine once in my life. I don't know those drugs. I've never used them. Whereas if you look at blood thinners and steroids, I'm about as expert in the use of them as you can. I'm an expert in the literature and the evidence around it. By the way, steroids, even in that study, was described as controversial. And you know why it was described as controversial? Because there's 25 years of studies without a conclusion. But I will tell you, if you look carefully through those studies, especially the more modern ones, you can tell which ones are positive and why they're positive. So early means you can save lives. So if you use it early, there's tons of negative trials, but when you look at the doses and when they were initiated, you get the signal is that, yes, steroids don't work unless given early. And so I wanted to differentiate those two, yet all the scientists were lumping them all together. They thought steroids was as experimental as hydroxychloroquine, and I wanted to pull my hair out. I wanted to be like, listen, I've been spending, my whole life, 2 decades, the majority of my days in ICUs trying to keep dying patients alive, and you're going to tell me that this drug that I know more than any other is experimental to me? And I've really found it insulting. And like I similarly found that statement I was telling you about before, whereas, if you read that article and it shows all the things that they got wrong, which is a lot of these experimental drugs turned out to probably the data is showing that they don't work, whereas steroids is working, and we know anticoagulation is working. When the journalist asked the editor of the New England Journal what he thought about my promoting the use of steroids and the fact that I was vindicated when the recovery trial came out, is he said that I got lucky. And I got to tell you, Sean, I felt that was really insulting and not understanding of my expertise as an intensivist. I'm an expert at critical care. I'm an expert at what's called ARDS, which is when the lungs fail. I know how to get these patients better. I've studied all the medicines. I'm an expert at the evidence base. And he tells me I'm lucky. I was really, really offended by that. In fact, some colleagues told me I should write him a little note. I don't know if I have the time to do that, but anyway.
It's easy for someone to sit in an ivory tower. It's easy for someone to sit anywhere and criticize. Here's what I talk about on my show quite a bit. It's hard to create something. It's easy to destroy something. So you're out there trying to do what you can to save. That's hard. It is so easy for someone to sit back and say, oh, well, that, if it did work, it probably was luck, or, oh yeah, of course that was going to be wrong. It's so easy to be hindsight is 2020 on this. It's ridiculous. And when you're faced with it, I can feel your pain. When I read it, and before you even said that, I read the article. And when that quote was right there, he got lucky. That is, I agree. I actually laughed out loud, because when you have an expert, you've probably been using this, a decade or a decade and a half? And
more than that, almost 2. Yeah.
And you're using it, and someone's saying it's luck. I mean, that is outrageous to me. Sorry about that. I feel for you.
Right.
So
yeah.
Vested interest. Let's bring that up. I mean, that's the New England Journal of Medicine that you mentioned. Vested interest playing a role in this, big pharma. I mean, what in math for sure, but in this whole kind of battle that's happening throughout the medical industry right now, big vested interest causing some of this.
I think one of the problems, as I've come to understand it, as some folks have shared me, is the problem is a lack of vested interest, meaning the medicines in Math Plus, you can't make $1 million off of them. They've been around for decades. We know them really well. There's no patent on them. And in fact, I have a colleague who was friends I have 2 colleagues, one of whom was close to someone on Capitol Hill, and they were discussing Math Plus. And when this person, I think it was an aide to a congresswoman or something, they said, there's just going to be no traction around this. There's just no pharmaceutical. There's no lobbyist. There's no lobby arm that's going to get behind Math Plus to promote it, because there's nothing there that you can't make money off of this. So it's not like Big Pharma is actively putting it down. It's more like they're not going to promote it, right? Because it's not in their best.
They make nothing out of it. It's no interest to them.
I will say, though, this is being highly cynical. I don't want to be inflammatory, but let's say Math Plus did take off and became a sort of a national protocol and was used. I wonder do you think it lies within the realm of possibilities that a big pharma company might have a negative opinion on Math Plus? And I'm just being sarcastic and cynical, right?
That's a pretty easy sarcasm there. Of course, if you're not going to make money, this is the time that these pharma companies are going to make a ton of money. And they are, with the vaccine and the amount of billions that are flowing into these companies to overlook. Let's just look at that for a second, Dr. Kory. You have $8 billion now has been poured out from the government to pharmaceutical companies for the vaccine. If some protocol, Math Plus, comes along and it starts showing that, hey, if you get COVID and you really get into trouble, we pretty much have a way to solve it, the need for the vaccine, likely in the people's minds, decreases. So I hate to go into those dark areas, but there is a lot at stake financially for all of this right now. So it is interesting you say that, because there isn't a vested interest there. This doesn't get pushed forward because this stuff is not on patent. There's not going to be it's readily available. It's cheap.
But there's no randomized controlled trial on it. And that's the thing. No one's going to get behind it just because 2 really smart, very well published and very well respected doctors are using it at their hospitals with excellent outcomes. That's just not enough to push the needle in medicine. It's both a shame, and some would argue that it's a strength. I don't, but some might.
There's a friend of the family that saw the protocol I sent the video to, and the doctor. He's a doctor. He's not in critical care. He's a medical doctor in another field. He said, "Oh, I've heard of it. I've heard of math, and I guess in the end we'll find out if they're right." That really set me back. I'm like, really, what's happening, it sounds like, is there's a lot of doctors out there going, well, all right, well, we'll see if these guys are right. They're not going to use it. Just time will tell, which is so frustrating to me and the public, because if we could lower deaths, it looks like it works, let's say. If we have enough try it, it lowers deaths. And that tells me in the public that it's not so scary to go outside. Hopefully the government start opening the country back up again. Businesses don't need to fail needlessly anymore. We don't have the disaster that isn't even played out yet. We're all still kind of comfy getting our unemployment and everything's still kind of nice. But if this thing keeps going too long, the outcome is going to be disastrous for the United States of America, not only us, but the world. So this is where I don't understand. I get on my soapbox for a minute. If I'm the president or if I'm a governor or if I'm a top health official I am searching day and night for something that looks like it might work to lower this darn death rate so we can get our country back going, then regain our strength again. So this is my frustration. I just want, I'm not a doctor at all. I just see this and get a little bit freaked out why this isn't being used more.
So you're making a lot of sense in your rationale, and I'm about to make more sense for you. And this is where I really struggle. So this sort of argument that you put out, which is it seems to work. We now have accumulating data, maybe not randomized, but it's a reasonable, rational therapy developed by experts. We're not just like one guy with a practice in the boonies, is saying that I treated 1,000 patients and they all did well. Now, I'm not putting down some of those doctors, but there have been a lot of suspect claims in COVID. There's been a lot of drugs that have been touted to work and yet been disproven. And so you have to understand everybody is really, a bit gun shy. And historically, so also, that throughout the history of medicine, doctors are trained and have learned to be highly, highly skeptical. Here's the key, and I want to bring out this point, and this is where I can be a little bit dramatic. So this is where I literally want to jump out a window. But skepticism in medicine should be proportionate to the potential harm and cost of the therapy. So if you have this new drug that's never been used in anyone before, and maybe it'd have like a compound name, like, H7572, right? Some little compound that came out of a lab, that needs to be extensively tested, not only for safety, but since you really don't know what its outcomes are, you want to be very, very conservative in how you employ it, right? And also the level of data that you should require before actually approving it to say that this is good. You want to have that a very high threshold to exceed. Let's look at what's in Math Plus, right? These are drugs that are super well known. The safety profiles are very well known. The adverse effects of steroids are totally overstated in the short term. And I've seen a lot of naysayers against steroids and Math Plus, and they always cite these very old articles saying that you can get more infections. It's just not true. In all of these major, huge trials, we don't see those differences in those who get steroids and not. So number one, they're safe. But for instance, we have vitamin D in there. We have statin in there. They all have really good biological plausibility, some emerging clinical data that they're working. They're super safe. Vitamin D, vitamin C, and thiamine, those are all three vitamins. You can't hurt someone with vitamins. That's number one. Number two, we have a statin in there. We have famotidine, which is Pepsid. It's an antacid. Half the country's on an antacid. So we're not introducing really risky new drugs. And so if you want to say we will not promote this therapy unless it's rigorously tested, I want to knock and say, do you see what we're using? We're using these drugs that we understand and know the mechanisms of action really well. There's a ton of biological plausibility about why it would have antiviral or anti-inflammatory effects. And so why wouldn't you use it and then study instead of waiting for data before using? You understand what I'm saying? And so yeah. This is when I make too much sense, and that's why I don't understand.
Then you have to hit your head against the wall.
Exactly.
So before we end, I'm going to give you the last word. But before I even give you that, what would the general public? You're talking to the general public, and they're out here. They're scared. They might get it. A friend might get it. A family member might get it. Their oxygen levels are lowering. Any advice?
Whew. So to be honest, Sean, I've been asked this question before, maybe in a little different format. In fact, I was once asked a few months ago by someone asked me, what would I tell the patient to tell their doctor? Okay, so first of all, your first question is, I would go to the hospital. Again, if they're having a viral illness, now getting shortness of breath, I'm really worried. I mean, the predominant cause of death and organ failure is the lungs. So if you start to feel that your lungs, are not working so well, go get checked out, period. So go get checked out. But then, like, the question that you didn't ask is, and but you did mention it earlier in our discussion, is like, where is Math Plus being used? How can you find it if you think that this is the right therapy, you think it's safe and valid, and you tend to believe in some of the outcomes that are coming out of these hospitals? How do you convince your doctor? Well, number one, you don't. It's going to be very hard to convince a doctor. You're not a medical doctor. I'm talking to your listeners now. They're not medical doctors.
And me either, just so everybody knows. Yep.
Right. And so trying to tell a doctor how to treat you is completely backwards. It doesn't work like that, right? So they're the ones with the medical degree. They're the ones responsible for what they prescribe. And if they think it's either risky or dangerous or unproven, they're not going to do it. Here is the one reassurance, is that since early COVID, the role of steroids has now been accepted, and it's pretty standard now. And I will tell you, in Math Plus, the most important medicine is the steroid. So I want to reassure folks, you might not get Math Plus in its, as Dr. Marek calls it, the full Monty form, right, with all of the little, the safe little additions in medicines. But you are going to probably get some form of the two foundational ones, which is a steroid and some amount of blood thinner, especially as you get sicker. The others you might not get. Again, the added benefit of those others, we don't know. We do think that there is some signal there because, our outcomes really are magnitudes lower than what we've been seeing published. And we think it really is related to the synergy and the combination therapy that we're using. But yeah, I would just tell them to get checked out, be reassured that a couple of the medicines have now been validated. And this may sound silly or naive, but you can always point them to our website and who we are. And I hope that our credibility as 5 really well-known doctors in our specialty, I'm known as an ultrasound expert. I published books on that, and I'm known as an educator. Dr. Marek is known worldwide. Dr. Maduri is the world's expert on corticosteroids and critical illness. Dr. Verone has been an editor of multiple journals. So we do have a lot of scientific and professional credibility. It's, we're not just like one guy in a corner saying that I found the cure. And so that might sway a doctor. Is that helpful?
Fair enough. And I think the key point there is, if you're starting to feel short of breath, get to the hospital. It sounds like that is.
Can I add one other thing is that, I think you noticed this, Sean, but, we recently redid our website, and we completed, I spent all summer actually working with my colleagues on this, but we completed an 8,000 word scientific review where we actually went through the basic science, the preclinical animal, as well as human studies that are emerging, supporting each and every one of the medicines in there. And so for a doctor, if they're interested, I think it's a more valid source now for a doctor to read, to see what we're about and why we are using these medicines.
Fair enough. That's good. Yeah, I saw the website. It's great. And again, you can see it on the screen now. So last words. We're going to wrap up. I don't know what, that's a good, you just sprung that on me. I'm going to say, we're trying, I'm fighting, I don't know why our viewpoint is a little bit in the minority. I would just say that when I use the word conservative, I'm not using the political spectrum, but I'm just saying, physicians are trained to be scientifically conservative, right? Not to adopt new ideas and treatments unless, they're really, really scientifically certain and there's a lot of data. I'm not saying that I'm cavalier or I'm this enthusiastic early adopter at the latest claim. I am not. I think very deeply and very clearly about everything I do. It's not that I'm less cautious. I'm just willing to be a little bit more open-minded and flexible and weighing risks and benefits. And at the same time, all of us on all parts of that philosophical spectrum in medicine, we're all working really hard. We all want to do better with this. We all want to get everyone better. And I think we're all going to fight the good fight. We think we have an early answer, and we hope that we find more attention to that and more support. And I think it's happening slowly. I look forward to it being validated. So just like your use of steroids early on was validated. So thank you for the fight, all of you guys. What you're doing is awesome, saving lives, and hopefully, again, if we can spread it, we can get the country going a little bit faster. So you're off to New York now to do some
North Carolina.
South Carolina.
Greenville, South Carolina. Yeah, I have a new job that starts in Milwaukee in a few months, but I had some time in between, and I decided to go hunt COVID. So I'm taking over an ICU down there, and I'll be doing that for a couple of weeks a month for the next 3 months.
Well, we may check in with you to see how that's going. But in the meantime and during that, stay safe, you and your family, as we get through this. Thanks
Appreciate it,
for being
Sean.
on.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Dr. Pierre Kory, more information on Math Plus. I really been supporting these doctors because based on what I can see, looks like things are going very well at the hospitals that they're running. I think it's important that we try to find, I don't need to say it again, find something that's going to bring the death rate down so we don't have to rely on this magical vaccine that maybe or may not work someday down the road. But we need to get out of this recession. We need to get people back to work because this is going to really destroy the country if we let this go too long. We've already dumped out $3 or $4 trillion, whatever it is. We just can't handle that financially. We need workers to go back. We need to get our system going again. And so that's one of the reasons I jump on this. Besides that, we can actually save lives. So check it out. Again, on the screen is where you go, critical care, COVID-19 criticalcare.com. All sorts of research information on there. Share it with others. Share it. The reason I push this out to others is like, look, I may not get it. You may think you're never going to get this thing. Dr. Verone in my last show, by the way, you can go to seanburke.net and see that show with him and Dr. Merrick also on YouTube. Dr. Verone said there's two kinds of people in the world. Those who have COVID and those, well, I almost did the thing, those that actually are going to get COVID. So as far as they're concerned, everyone's going to get it. So you might as well understand if you're going to not, let's say you don't get it, but you have a friend or a family member or something that does need to go to the hospital, it's kind of nice to know this information, don't you think? All right, share it if you will, if you like it. That's what I've been doing. And that's it. I hope you're being safe. I hope things are going all right with you. There's a lot going on in the country as far as the caseload dropping, which is good. Number of cases. In fact, the number of deaths are not so high, and they're coming down too. So it's looking a little bit positive. All right, stay safe. Take care of each other. That's really, really important. Talk to you the next time. Bye-bye.